And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be male only spaces, but the movement isn't one of those. The cultural renaissance needs to include everybody, and women can sell it better than anyone. And I say this as somebody who's been in the movement long enough to see what it looked like when there were like no women in it. And I would go to a conference and be like one of maybe 5 women there and the only one under the age of 50. Versus now where there's so many women, and the vast majority of the women in the movement appear to be good looking or wholesome or talented in some way, and they're real assets. So why would we want to drive them off by calling them thots? It makes no sense.
The important point being that we wouldn't, but who would?
Who would indeed?
Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, speaking this evening where I am, with Kat, Philosophicat. And she has joined me this evening to discuss a number of terms current among the dissident right, those who are on the dissident right, of the dissident right. We're just going to roll through these. We've got a number of terms. We've got terms like movement. We've got tradition, trad thought, gatekeeper, boomer, Nazi, grifter, fash and fashy, concern trolling, all of these things. So bear with us through this introduction, and we will jump right into the subject. Please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as the sister channel, A Safer Space, both on YouTube and on BitChute. I'm also on Minds. I'm on Gab. I'm on Twitter. And for those who wish to support the channel, there is GoFundMe and there is Subscribestar. And if you want to send me things that are both legal and moral, I have a post office box address. That is P.O. Box 16006, Atlanta, Georgia, 30316. So yes, before we get started with our a review of this terminology, of this dubious lexicon, perhaps you, Kat, can very quickly introduce yourself for our audience and tell them where they can find you.
Sure. Also, I did not know you had a second channel. This is the first time hearing about that.
Yeah. I got shut down.
Yes,
I got shut down.
Channel too. So my channel is just Philosophicat, which I'm sure you'll link below or whatever, or I'll drop it in the comments. And I'm also on Twitter and Gab and Minds, and I have like a Patreon and a Subscribestar now that I just set up. So if people want to support the Revolt series that I'm doing. So that's me.
Well, I should have done a better job. It's, of course, my job as the host to introduce guests. So I will add that Kat has all sorts of content on her channel. A very popular thing that she has been working on for quite some time is a series of videos dealing with Julius Evola. And I believe a number of those have been translated into, or at least subtitled, into a variety of European languages. Kat is also a musician. She has a band called Uberfolk, if I'm remembering correctly. And she has been releasing music, and I believe recently working on a music video as well. Is that right, Kat?
Yes. Yes, it is. So hopefully that'll be out soon.
Excellent.
You did a way better job introducing me. When people are like, tell me about yourself, I'm just like, I don't know what to say.
Well, there it is. We're over the hump.
Thank you. Thank you for covering me for me.
Indeed. People can check out your channel whenever they like. There will be a link placed, and we have this subject of these terms. And the reason I'm interested in these, and perhaps Kat can also tell us why she was interested in talking about this stuff, is that at least for my part, I see that they get thrown around all the time, and there's very much this sort of way that, for a certain generation, they said man. And then for another generation, they say dude. It's very much the same kind of thing where some of these things are just very much fashionable. So they propagate mimetically and appear on everyone's lips, and as is the case with many of the words that we use, they are they're not very carefully considered or thought about in a lot of cases, and that tends to annoy me, given that I tend towards autism. Another thing that I noticed was that they have this business of talking about the movement, and if you take a look, for example, at like Bernie Bros, they also talk about the movement, and seeing that sort of thing going on both sides also sort of popped up some little flags for me that made me want to grub about and look a bit more closely at all of it. So that's where I'm coming from in looking at these terms. Also, some of it's just funny shit, So before we go into the terms themselves, what is it about this topic, Miss Cat, that caused you to think perhaps that this would be worth our time to review?
Yeah, these questions about terminology are kind of, they're meta questions that people don't really think about too often. As you say, they're words that just kind of get thrown about and they just kind of percolate through society and people's verbiage without a lot of thought as to what they actually mean, whether or not it's appropriate to use that terminology. And I mean, I don't have anything against people just using whatever word comes to mind. I'm not judging people for the words they use or anything, but I do think sometimes it's worth exploring them a little bit more in depth and getting some clarity on them.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases you'll see that there's it frames things in a certain way. So using the word white privilege, or the term I should say, white privilege, sets it up as though there's a special privilege enjoyed by whites, and in terms of minorities coming in and asserting their right to be to have those same privileges. You've actually framed it in a way where suddenly privileges have to be distributed. And if you assume that one group already has them, but the other ones need them, and if that group in fact does not have them, then you've essentially set up a system where others get them. So that's one way, the choice of terminology can frame things conceptually in such a way that it furthers, for example, a very concrete program. There are other ways, with propaganda where they talk about Saddam Hussein and his spider hole. You make this association with a kind of imagery, and you have the idea that he was pulled out of the ground in Iraq, and ooh, it's scary. It's like a spider hole, these black hairy legs coming out of this cobwebbed orifice in the dirt, and how you would recoil from it. These are pretty straightforward things that you see with propaganda and the propagandistic use of language that the left so enjoys. And we see it also, I was just watching the debate with Stefan Molyneux and JF, and Stefan just suddenly seized upon, like a proud little terrier that got something in his teeth. He seized upon this whole business of rape coming up as an example of whether or not something is morally acceptable, and he just went with it. I was kind of like, no, you're not gonna, no, you're not, and he did. He just started to completely associate JF with rape and rapists and child rapists, and talked about how he had to take a bath after the discussion was ended. And so these are other things that, had to change out of his clothes. Get in a different frame of mind, is what he said. After having talked to JF, he had to get that off him. These kinds of things, all these sorts of games are there, but these are terms that, let's say, at least in a qualified way, that we use in our movement. So if there's any place where the terminology that's being used should be subject to consideration, this would seem to be it, right? I mean, we use the terms. Should we not consider the implications, or at least attempt to get some kind of shared definition regarding what they mean? So that's what drove me. I just have these sort of listed out. I don't know how it goes together with your order, but I've got.
I think I've got the same order as you.
All right, so we were passing notes back and forth to get this sorted out before we did the discussion. Okay, so shall I start with the movement, and then with the next one you start, and we'll just alternate?
Go for it.
All right. Well, the first thing that occurs to my mind when I think about the movement is peristalsis. It seems to it just immediately conjures images of bowel movements. So whenever someone talks about proudly, the movement, we've got to, it's a part of the movement, that tends to make me just stop. I have this sort of a general rule in life is that I trust my aesthetics. And if I just recoil from a term because of what it conjures, I have to kind of trust that. So that's an immediate impression. Now, when you get away from just that kind of silliness, as I mentioned, you've got people on the right saying the movement, and then people on very much on the left saying the movement. And that raises flags for me, or rings alarm bells, because I then look at the fact that we've got movement without knowing where you're going. It's not as though anyone here is talking about, for example, the direction, or let's be even more hopeful about how it could be. It's not like they're talking about the goal. So they're not talking about where you're going. You're not even talking about the trajectory. You're just sort of talking about movement. And that brings to mind all the business with like woke versus based, which I don't dislike that much, because woke is just someone who's been jabbed, who's leapt up, who's been stimulated, who's been goaded, right? Driven in some way, based usually on some superficial emotional response. Based, on the other hand, is the idea of a foundation, right? But the movement carries us over into woke land, in terms of the symbolism, and I hammer on this fairly often. In terms of the symbolism in the West, you have the idea of rulership. You have a crook and a flail, right? So you can whip the beast forward, or you can put the crook around its leg and drag it back like a shepherd's crook. And you see that in ancient Egypt. It's a rod of rulership and a flail. And they're combined because there's the ability to restrain and to goad them forward. Goad, gad. Gad was an old word for Christ's nails, or a spike. We still use it for gadflies that sting. We have the Latin word stimulus, which is just a way of saying a cattle goad. It just means a sharp stick that you stick a cow with. That's called a stimulus in Latin. We have it with the kentron in Greek, where you have the chariot driver who has the little hook and the little point. You can see it on the old seal stones and some of the black vases. The chariot driver holds this long rod, and it's got a little hook coming backwards and a little one going forward, so you can hook or poke. And it's in fact the same thing that you see in India with the sign of rulership that is the ankus, or elephant goad. It's got a hook to catch them, and it's got a point to prick them forward. And so whenever I think about the movement, that's what comes to mind. It's this idea of movement without knowing where you're going. And that in turn brings to my mind the whole business of an animal in the middle of a herd. When I think about the movement, well, that seems to me precisely what you would get if you were a bison in the midst of a huge herd of bison, running off for hundreds of yards in all directions with just bodies next to you. And you would experience the things that were happening to you as the movement, because they would all start to groan and make their cow noises, and they would rock back and forth, and a scent of fear might ripple through the body of the gathered herd animals, because one of them spotted a hunter or wolves, or fill in the blank. It's the movement. So the imprecision of it, to me, reeks of reinforcing a program where people are just supposed to go, go, go without thinking. I often talk about this too in TV shows where the men are supposed to go attack. There's always got to be some guy there who takes his arm, waves it, and says, go, go, go. There's got some gestures. It's the hunting language of men who must be, almost silent, speaking with their hands as they seek the prey, and it moves from hunting to warfare. And the movement just seems to me like a go, go, go without the, well, where and why. I'm not saying that you should be trapped by the paralysis of analysis, but in general, that term makes me just kind of lean back and go,
I had a similar thought on that as well. Mine is, you always kind of know all this origin of all the etymology of the words and stuff. And I find that very interesting. For me, I'm kind of coming from a place where I've been in the movement for a very long time. And yes, I would definitely agree that there is no defined goal that it's really moving towards. And some people will argue with me on that, but bear with me and I'll come back to that. But yes, it's just kind of moving with the herd the way you described. And I think it's when people talk about the movement, I think what they're referring to really is more of a mindset than a movement. And there's a difference in how you approach it if you think of it as a mindset, because a movement should have a final objective that it is moving towards. No, like you're attached to a desired outcome. And having collective goals and envisioning yourself as part of a movement can be really exciting for people. But it can also burn you out because you expect to achieve that destination quickly. So, I mean, what is the stated goal of the movement? It's like, save white people. Oh, that's so vague and abstract, right? What does that actually look like? How do we get there? Is it even achievable? So what happens is, there's this frustration that builds up in people because they haven't secured this white future in the whopping 5 years that they've been in the movement. They don't understand that, it's an existential struggle. It's multi-generational. It has no ending. The movement will always exist in that sense as long as there are tribes and nations that want to survive in this world that challenges everything that lives. And we have to constantly renew that commitment to survival. There is not ever going to be a period in time where we can just rest on our laurels and be like, right, we've secured a white homeland. We never have to worry about this again. Because as long as there are other tribes in the world who are competing for resources, as long as there are predatory animals out there of any kind that want to eat us, like, you are always going to have to fight for your survival. People need to understand this. So in that sense, there's no beginning or end, and there's no way to actually define victory. So it's really more of a cultural expression rather than a movement. When I think of a movement, it's more like in the political sense, where it's a bit more short term with a specific goal, like perhaps to get someone elected. What we really need to have perhaps is more of a cultural renaissance rather than a movement as such. Political movements could then spring from that. Political movements are downstream from cultural renaissances. But what we're doing is not really a political movement. You tend to see a lot of like the purity spiraling amongst people, where it's like, oh, if you disagree with me on such and such, the fact that we both are like wanting white people to survive into the future doesn't matter anymore because, oh, you're too socialist or you're too libertarian or what, you're too accelerationist. It's like, so you've got people working at cross purposes. Are we in the same movement in that case? Just because, we both want to see white people survive, but we're trying to achieve a very different looking future. So it's really hard to have any kind of cohesive movement in that sense because there's just too much disparity between how people think that should be best achieved. So I do think that maybe the culture war is really more important than the so-called movement because it's also more meta-political because if you're just focused on a specific political issue rather than a cultural shift or changing how we view people in our place in the world, because culture is that underlying force that supports politics. And instead, what we have is a whole movement that is black-pilled because they're putting the cart before the horse. They want to skip the step of fundamental cultural change, and they want to go straight to political policies. And this leads to authoritarianism because there's no cultural support for these ideas, so they have to accomplish it with force. And you cannot change the culture with political decrees. And part of this, I think, is because the movement's very young and they come into it with this instant gratification mindset. Like, they don't have the world the way they want it to be, so they feel kind of stuck in this catch-22 where they think, oh, well, I can't become who I want because the outside world doesn't support me in that, and I can't change the outside world because I haven't changed myself. So then where do you go? And as you say, it's very directionless. It's just kind of moving with the herd, whichever way the wind blows. It's not really moving towards an end point, and nobody even will agree on what that end point is. So I actually do not like the term the movement, but I use it just because it's like, well, what else do you call it that people are going to understand what you're talking about?
And the terms that are in common use, they come unbidden
Yes.
to the lips. Yes.
Indeed.
Well, then, this one is your turn that you get to start on, which would be what? Tradition, traditional, trad? No, trad. Is that how we put it?
I have trad and traditional. and they are kind of related. It's this whole concept of like trad is I find it equally funny and annoying. It's this slang term that's very bourgeois and simplistic. There's nothing revolutionary about it. Feels very LARPy, and it really just lacks anything of substance. It's if that small t of trad and traditional were to become kind of a big T and become more about the substance of perennial wisdom, then I think that would be it would be a terrific development. But I think people just want to bring back this aesthetic, which it has a very plebeian type of feel to it, in my opinion. It doesn't feel like any kind of revolutionary philosophy that has any endpoint. And there is always something a little bit cringy about seeing somebody dressed in what appears to be a costumes. And that does happen when it's the aesthetic you're going for, because how do we express aesthetic if not in what we wear, how we present ourselves, and how we kind of structure our lifestyle in a very visible way? But it's interesting to me that it's mainly women that tend to take on this trad label. I see a lot of women calling themselves trad wives. I don't see a lot of men calling themselves trad husbands. And I do think there's an element of this that plays really strongly into women's sense of public shaming, public approval, the vanity, narcissism. It's just another form of right-wing virtue signaling, kind of like there's this competition to see who can be more trad. And I mean, I don't want to put people down like that, because I do think there can be some value in that as a stepping stone. And we all have to start somewhere, but I think there's like a segment of the population that realizes how much nicer that time in the past was for women, even if still in a bourgeois sense. But it's a time that we have a lot of photo and video evidence from, like the 50s, so we can actually kind of like see it and connect with it. And it's a time when people seemed very happy and healthy, and it's natural to want that. It shouldn't be held up to scorn. But taken to an extreme and sort of lacking any other substance, it does become a little bit cringy, especially when it looks costumed. There's obviously something that's a little bit odd about that. And I mean, we want people to be more traditional and have this be seeded as a meme amongst young people, but many young people are new to this and they're not sure how to go about it, and they end up executing it in a way that can be easily mocked, because young people don't see things in the meta sense. They're too involved and they get caught up in it. They fail to see the propaganda value in what they're doing. And when you look back in the earlier days of the movement, back in, say, the 90s, the only girls in the movement were kind of like these trashy looking skinheads. And it's so much better optics
Chelsea
to have.
Haircuts.
Yeah. And it's so much better optically to have these girls who are pretty and wholesome, and they seem marriageable. And they seem like the kind of girls that you could raise a family with.
Right.
So they might start with only this insubstantial interest, only, going for the aesthetic, but that could develop more deeply as time goes on. And even if it doesn't, there's no harm in them doing it, really. It is still a pleasing aesthetic. And I think there is value in that, especially as a meme. But when it comes to the men, yeah, they're just not as interested in being trad. And I think it's because they're kind of lost in the hyper intellectualization of the ideas, this sort of purity spiraling and mental masturbation. They don't really want to live trad. They just want to think about it, whereas women want to live it, but don't want to think about it. And it's not really women's job to think about the ideas and figure it all out. They tend to leave that to the men while they sort of focus on the part that they want to do. So I'm kind of in two minds about this concept of trad, where on the one hand, yes, it's cringy in a way, but it's also representative of something positive and wholesome that I think could be developed into something very useful, not just in a propaganda sense, but also just in a social context that is actually good and healthy for people if it was directed in the right way.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. It's a seed, right? And will it grow, and how will it grow, and the rest? These are serious questions. Like you said, there's the idea of some kind of a rebirth or renaissance or a return to some of these things that all of us can look back at our culture and see, used to be there, and by comparison with the present, see that it probably is not, out there in the same way that it once was. But there's the business of establishing the roles and how that happens, and that's where you kind of come around to that business of it being LARPy or whatever, the idea that they're trying to fake it till they make it. And that has its place. That's how children play, and they play and they take on these roles based upon behavior that to them seems to be most likely to yield we could say survival advantage, but let's back up from that and just talk more immediately. It will seem to give them status. They'll have friends, people will like them, they'll exercise power or social influence, or find a wife or a husband or whatever. So children, when they are out playing in the schoolyard, you don't see them say, well, Johnny, I'm going to be a bum. And Mary's like, I'm going to be a homeless drug addict, right? Johnny says, no, I'm going to be a fireman or an astronaut or the president, right? And Mary says, I'm going to be once upon a time would have said a nurse or a famous writer or something. These days, it's probably all about how she's going to be an expert in a STEM field or a superhero. But the point remains that, the children take the roles based on what they imagine they could be and what they think will work well for them. And yet what we see out there is all kinds of roles that don't work. So for example, you can see that's the thing about television. It just reinforces this non-existent world. But we use that world, we take readings from it, we see it as a kind of feedback through which or by which we make determinations about what is the right direction to go, right? So let's just look at it like this. It's really difficult to accurately fire rounds out of a pistol when you're holding it up sideways, like a fool, right? But you'll see a TV program that will show you that that's great behavior. If you hold your pistol up like that sideways, not only will you kill everyone who's coming after you, but you'll probably have a really nice car that's all, kitted out. And you'll have crowds of women in bikinis who like to rub your back while you're playing pool with your buddies around the pool table wearing lots of gold chains, right? Except that's not how it really works. And yet we see it as though it does. So I understand the desire to push back against that and to introduce roles that seem to be founded on something more real. But there really is there's a gap. There's a gap that has begun to yawn between the generations. And I think it's one of the things that has come as a result of the way in which leftists have sought to drive all sorts of wedges between generational cohorts. So when I lived in Turkey, I was like, this is great. I'm going out in the evening, I'm going to have some drinks with my friends, and a bunch of people are meeting us, and we go to a cafe that's, big and got these long tables, and you'd be at the one end of it, and your friends would show up through the night, and people would kind of come and go as you talked, and someone might go dance at the other end where they have an impromptu little DJ thing, and people would have their drinks. But you'd see people coming in their 20s, people I was at the time in my 30s, early 30s, people would come in their 50s. And you knew each other because it was a city, it was cosmopolitan, people are passing by, they know each other, they stop in and they talk, or, with seeing families. So in certain cultures, and once upon a time here, there were opportunities for young people and old people to, or rather for old people to communicate aspects of the past to young people. I mean, obviously their interaction is two-way, but for purposes of what I'm talking about here, the big thing is that young people have got to sit around and listen to the old fuckers talk about how things used to be, and maybe show them things, explain things. We have less of that, and worse still, as I touched upon, the generational cohorts have been set at each other's throats. Millennial is just as much a term of derision as boomer is going in the other direction. And so we've been split off from our past, I think, in some respect there. And tradition, just to go with etymology, I have it noted down here. It comes from trans and dare, to give over in Latin. And so it's like tradition is essentially like transmission, a presentation, a handing over. And that the links in that chain have been screwed with. They've kind of tried to cut them out. And so we see people trying to create it all ab nihilo, out of nothing. And that's just the part that worries me, because there is a kind of social engineering utopianism to the idea that we're just going to impose these roles as best we can understand them. We just put a nickel in and turn the gumball machine, and out came, traditional life 101 with this sort of superficial treatment of how, I guess what I need to do is, find a 1940s way to tie my hair up and get an apron, right? And everything else will just kind of work out from there. Now, I don't mean to dog on that too much, because as we talked about before, kids play that way. Hell, if I'm trying to learn some new dance move, I look like an idiot as I'm trying to figure it out and get used to it, And a friend of mine who is studying singing had her singing teacher just said straight to her, look, you're going to sound awful. Just get ready. You're going to sound stupid and awful. Now, practice, So you have to get from where you are to where you're going. And so I don't mean to be like, wiping off the board, but the traditional stuff, I guess the summary statement I should make, other than concern about just another utopian attempt to impose something that won't come naturally, is the difference between a circle, you got your Spenglerian cycles, right? But there's also the idea of a spiral. And I think in reality, the best you're going to get is going to be a spiral. If you look at it, on this axis, it will seem pretty much to be a circle, right? But if you turn it, you'll see that it's actually winding up. So yeah, you come back around to the same clock position, but each time you're ascending, so to speak, this axis. And so it's
descending.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah.
Probably actually, more often descending, I would say.
Well, here in the darkness of the Kali Yuga, yes. So.
Well, gravity has its role to play. It's always harder to go up. But I agree with you about the social utopia kind of engineering stuff. And that is an aspect I hadn't really considered. But I think you're right about that. I think it's another expression of this sort of authoritarianism that is born out of the fact that there is no cultural support for these ideas. So they just want to implement it by force through authoritarian ways. And of course, there's this tendency especially when thinking about gender roles within the movement. And this is something that annoys me, because it is just it's such shallow and lazy thinking. It's a very communist way of thinking, this idea that, well, everyone just needs to play their role and they just need to fit into this box and do what they're told. And if you're not doing that, then you're the one screwing up utopia. And it's like, well, no, utopia is being screwed up because your idea sucks. And that's just, it's like not compatible with human nature. It's just fundamentally incorrect. And there is just, among certain segments of the dissident right, there is very much this current of just this very rigid, dogmatic thinking that kind of plays into this whole trad life concept. If you're not doing X, Y, and Z according to your assigned gender role that they've decided you should have, that has no wiggle room for your individual merits and talents and desires, of course it's destined to fail. It has the seeds of its destruction built right into it. It's just going to make people miserable. And how is that a utopia? Nobody wants to participate in that. It's terrible optics. You're not going to sell that to anybody, because nobody likes being told that they have to change who they are to fit into some socially constructed box. And this is kind of one thing that I've sort of tried to address in a couple of my own videos, these rigid concepts of gender roles, because I just don't think they're useful. And I don't think they apply to the vast majority of people. So, I like to present a more wholesome and well-rounded and flexible view of these things that is still within the ideas of like capital T traditionalism, but not this lowercase t traditionalism that is very LARPy and lacking in substance. I'm only in favor of that lower t traditionalism as a stepping stone to lead people to where there's substance.
Right.
But without that, it's just another social engineering program from people who are frustrated that the world is not the way they want it to be.
Right. And you have the implicit business there of when will it ever be? And it won't. So just be aware that everything is going to be a compromise and so forth. And therefore, beware those circumstances, not to be too trite, but where the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. That's always the sign of utopian thinking. And, obviously women and men, while they have their own areas of specialization, they've worked out, sexual dimorphism to support these different roles in terms of child rearing or, hunting and fighting. There's a reason you don't have a big brow ridge on your forehead, right? You're not built to take, axe handles to the head, whereas, we're supposed to have a better chance of making it through that, right? There are all sorts of different ways that we diverge, but the bottom line is that there's a considerable amount of overlap. And that doesn't mean it's going to work for all people in all places and times, but you'll have your individual males or females who will, they're the best chefs. This may piss a lot of women off, but, the people who focused historically on producing the most wonderful types of food of all kinds and turning it into an art, if not a science, these are male chefs. That doesn't mean that they're somehow feminine and outside their traditional roles. If, for example, we say that there is a reason why women are associated with the hearthstone and the home as dominion, there are ways where it's not as simplistic as they tend to think it is. So it's kind of like, dissident right paper dolls.
If you don't leave any room in your society for outliers to do what they do best and to innovate, you're just going to have a very stagnant society that never goes anywhere, where everybody's kind of miserable.
Yeah, and who wants it? Who wants it?
And I don't think most people want it. I think there's only a very vocal minority that wants that. And I can only speculate on what their motivations would be, but none of my speculations are particularly flattering, so I'll keep them to myself. But if you're not going to allow for people to find their own way, I mean, this conception of just like forcing people into these very shallow and narrow roles, to me, I just feel like that reduces people's potential for growth, both personally and spiritually. And so I'm just opposed to that, because I want to see people grow personally and spiritually. And you cannot do that within a very rigid system. I don't think that that's good for our people. And I don't think it's compatible with a Western biospirit.
But you must agree, however that may be, that it's still sometimes fun. It's funny as hell to say, shut up, woman, get back in the kitchen.
Yeah, sure, it's funny.
All right, sorry. Okay, well then.
I like being in the kitchen. That's where all the snacks are.
Well, there we go. Well, then let's go over. I think it's my turn to start one, but I'm going to leave it to you with trad thought, because I don't even fucking know what to say about that. So before we get to Gatekeeper, which I'll try, trad thought, that's all you, Kat.
All right, we'll bend the rules just this once, because we don't want to be too rigid here.
Indeed.
Yeah, trad thought, and also e-thought is another one that I hear thrown around. It's when you're attaching the word thought to the label, you're really just saying that the girl is doing this for sexual attention.
And thoughts that hoe over there or some such?
Yeah, nice ghetto term. Obviously, there's legitimate cases where that is occurring, where the woman is doing it for sexual attention, but there are many more cases where that doesn't apply, and it's really unfair. I mean, and sometimes she may have mixed motivations. I mean, but it's really just a way of disregarding all women who are in the movement, and treats women as subversives and as disingenuous actors. You cannot divine a person's intentions, and it's not even important anyway. Like, you're not choosing the messiah of a new religion. Just judge the person by the quality of the content they put out, and that's all. The ideas will be picked up by others, and they'll be repeated. So the messenger doesn't really matter so much if the principles they speak about ring true. And I don't understand why it's acceptable to bring this ghetto term into our cultural milieu. Why has it become a joke amongst men who claim that they want traditional values to refer to women as thoughts? Its toxicity should be self-evident given its origins. But we've perpetuated this meme that appears to stand in direct opposition to what the movement claims to want. And I mean, it's not really part of any cultural renaissance that I would want to be a part of. You cannot achieve a cultural renaissance without women on board. I think you've worked in marketing or advertising or something, so you'll know this well, but the system uses women, pretty women especially, to sell literally everything. This is a known fact. This is something that the masters of advertising have used. Women are seen as kinder, they're less capable of being mean. And, we all know that that's not how women actually are, but that is the perception. And therefore, women are used to market anything that involves winning people's trust. So what does the system think when they see all these pretty right-wing women popping up everywhere? They know it's going to be hugely influential to men. Women telling men to care about their people and their families and to fight for a future. Men respond then by wanting to be a part of that. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be male-only spaces, but the movement isn't one of those. The cultural renaissance needs to include everybody, and women can sell it better than anyone. And I say this as somebody who's been in the movement long enough to see what it looked like when there were like no women in it. And I would go to a conference and be like one of maybe 5 women there and the only one under the age of 50. Versus now where there's so many women and, the vast majority of the women in the movement appear to be good looking or wholesome or talented in some way. And they're real assets. So why would we want to drive them off by calling them thoughts? It makes no sense.
The important point being that we wouldn't, but who would?
Who would indeed?
Yes, I didn't mean to cut you off, though.
No, that's fine.
That's
it's a legitimate question. That you're kind of coming full circle to where I was going to end up is treating women as subversive. That in itself is subversive. You don't have to like women. You don't have to date women. You don't have to marry women. You don't have to trust women. But you cannot deny that having women in the movement is good optics, and it sells the movement a lot better than a man's only movement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Especially a man's only movement that's filled with misogyny and is just very negative, because the vast majority of people don't relate to that.
No, everybody loves tits, and if they reject women, then there are no more tits. I mean, and your point about seeming more accessible. Sorry, I didn't mean to get you while you were drinking, but look at for example at how well Laura Towler is serving as the sharp tip of Mark Collett's spear. I mean, and she puts her grandma on, and
Laura's a great girl. She's so sweet. How could somebody say that she's not an asset to the movement?
Exactly.
She's intelligent. She's well spoken. She's
Sure.
She's very wholesome. And you're going to call her subversive, call her a thought, and try to drive her away?
I didn't know. I was using her to illustrate how effective women can be and how their voice needs to be out there, because it's just much more accessible. You don't want to.
She's an excellent example. And there are women out there whose message is kind of, maybe they're just repeating talking points, or they're not that original, or their message is just kind of meh or even cringy. But the good ones rise to the top. Their ideas get repeated. And even if they are just repeating men's talking points, who cares as long as they get views? There seems to be, there's some jealousy, I think, sometimes that, a woman's just saying the same thing that men are saying, but she's getting 10 times more views and all these donations. It's like, it's because she's prettier to look at on camera, probably. Or she presents it in a much more palatable way. And I think that's actually the bigger factor than what she looks like, because there are plenty of men who have big audiences too, who maybe never appear on camera or who aren't that good looking. But women present the message in a way that is much more palatable to people, because they tend to do it in a way that is not shouty and angry, whereas men, they like their rants, and they can get quite negative and angry in the way that they speak, and it's not something that other women want to listen to. Like, I don't like particularly listening to shouty men, even if what they have to say is really clever. The vibe of it just kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of a downer. I don't want that in my day, even if it's great content. And I think a lot of women feel the same way. So it doesn't really matter who's repeating the message, as long as it's a good message and it's getting out there and it's reaching more people. Like, why this egotistical need to want to take credit for it? Just amplify the voices that are good and are gaining traction, regardless of who they are.
Right, and the other ones will just wither, dry up, and drop off. Right, and so this, I don't know much about the use of the term trad thought. That wasn't one specifically of mine. Have you found, just to help me get oriented here for context, are people like you or Laura Towler or others of these ladies, are you guys actually being called trad thoughts? Is that a term that's bandied about in reference to you?
I don't know of any female content creator who hasn't been called that. Maybe there are some, but there's always somebody who shows up calling you that. And it's just, I mean, it's so silly. You just disregard it.
All right. It's just like, yeah, fuck off. Okay. Well, then this brings us around. I think this is a very nice little segue into gatekeeper, because I have adopted a different model. You know, this idea of a gatekeeper, you think about someone who, I have in my notes here, presumably this refers to those who keep the message from getting out. And, you know, you find that there are people like that. I wrote down an example here. I just came across a good one, and it was this guy, Brendan O'Neill from Spiked, you know, in Britain. And he's like, both the alt-right and the woke left want you to think racially. Don't do it. Like, that seems like legitimately one of the classic gatekeeper statements, right? Here's an idea. It's bad no matter who does it. Don't you dare think it. Just don't think it. That's kind of classically what a gatekeeper is presented as being. But I see that just consistently what happens is it's not used in that way. It's basically used as a way to more or less shout down someone whose opinion you disagree with. Or I should be more precise, pardon me. It's a way to shout down someone who disagrees with your opinion. So if they come in and say, no, I don't think it's like that, and I wouldn't look at it that way, I don't think it's particularly productive. I mean, here, I'll consider it for you. Okay, I'm going to look at it like you do. Problem 1, problem 2, problem 3. Instead, I'm going to look at it like I do. Advantage 1, advantage 2, advantage 3. That's debate. That's putting forth a different point of view or attempting to refute someone and all the rest. I think it's very important that that not be mischaracterized as gatekeeping. And the idea of the gatekeeper is that somehow that person holds a key, and that by attempting to do or say or behave in this particular way, they'll keep you from getting to what they have locked away. And there's inherent, implicit in that is such a fucking surrendering of agency that it puts me in mind. I get in this argument all the time with, you know, right-wing people who are like, yes, we have been made victims. And I'm like, no, I don't want to be a victim. And they'll come in and they'll hit me with like the and I see why from where they're coming from, but they'll be like, that's like Ben Shapiro saying, you wouldn't want to be a victim, would you? Then why say that there's some group of people who did something to you to become a victim yourself? So I get what they're coming from. And I had some of them jump on me and be like, you're just like Ben Shapiro. I'm like, no, man. Even if the characteristics that you think warrant the designation are there, perhaps consider that they're your would-be victimizers, right? Just don't fucking take a slave's role. Don't take the role of someone who doesn't have agency. Don't take the role of someone who can't make up their minds for themselves and cut through it like a hot knife through butter, right? Don't frame things as though you don't have anything to do with how it goes. And so I see that as well with the idea of gatekeeper. You know, you see, you know, people, oh, he's a gatekeeper. And, you know, if he keeps doing what he's doing, that's why we have to stop him doing what he's doing, because he's keeping these other things from happening. And I just see people butt heads in situations where an adult simply steps over the object and keeps walking. You know, and I think that the many of the issues that people raise about gatekeepers, granting, of course, like in the example of this Brendan O'Neill guy or Ben Shapiro doing his, you know, dance, there are cases where you could legitimately say someone is pretty much doing that, but we should be careful not to confuse that with situations where someone simply disagrees with what we have said. I think a more important model, and this is why I said this is a good point to jump over to gatekeeper after you talked about how people show up and streams and they say, you're a trad thought, you know, shut your mouth, trad thought, white Sharia, get the fuck out of here, right? They come in and do that number. And we ask the question, well, why on earth would we want to stop an effective person propagating a message from doing so? And then the question is, well, we wouldn't. So who would? And so that's what I want to get at with this business of gatekeeper here. I think the whole metaphor, the whole way we describe it, I think it's stupid. What I like now is the image of a fish weir. And a fish weir is a way of getting fish out of a stream that's got a decent current. So if you take a look at a river, it's flowing in one direction, right? And what you can do, you know, people who've looked at, you know, survival, evasion, and escape manuals, right? And the guys who've tried to look into, well, how the hell am I going to feed myself if it all goes to shit? You know, many of them will have come across this. People who, maybe are really from out in the country will have direct experience with them. But what you do is you put a number of posts in the stream. So if you're looking, let's say the stream is running this way, right? And you're seeing it flow and it's flowing in this direction. You put in these posts like a V on either side, right? So you've got this V shape with upright posts in the stream, and then you can sort of make your own little wattle type arrangement, like a basket woven thing with vines and other sticks and twigs. So you basically made a fence out of wood, and it funnels the fish down to this one little point. And then beyond that, they make a little holding pen, because against the current of the water, once they pass through that narrow point, they find themselves bottled up in that spot. And very few of them are going to find the opening, the narrow one, because it's only that tiny percentage of the width of the stream. And it's going to be difficult for them to swim away upstream against the current. And the gatekeeper model is just, as I said, I think it's stupid, because it assumes that there's this guy with the key and you have to get rid of him in order to be able to get past it and open it. You have no ability here. You have to get this guy out of the way. When in fact, what I think is we've got something that's much more akin to a fish weir that bottles people up in certain conceptual areas. And this is the point at which I know you're about to ask me, Kat, you're about to say, that's so interesting, Oliver, but I sense inherently that there's something about the fact that there's a current in this stream. And you're going to connect all the dots here for us, how the stream is a metaphor for something happening out there in the world, like people coming and saying you're an Thot. Now,
yeah, tell us.
I would say you're absolutely right, Kat. That is what we were dealing with. The stream is, in fact, the social pressure that is exerted by all the bots and shitheads who come in policing how you can think and what you can do with their knee-jerk assignation of this term or the other one for you. They show up and they say, name the Jew, or they show up and they say, trad thought, or they come in. And if they're neo-pagans, they want to shit all over Christianity. Or if they're Christianity, they want to shit all over LARPing neo-pagans. And yet they create this current. And it's very strong. I've been exposed to it myself. I mean, you have the issue when you're talking on your channel to a group of people and your audience begins to expect a certain thing. And unless you're just kind of contrary by nature and inclined to just say no, then this pressure gets exerted. But it comes in comment sections. It comes with the chat streams. It's always manifesting there like a current pushing you. And it's always towards a narrow little opening that the current is going to flush you into until you're in this containment zone of what the acceptable ideas are. And usually they're going to be ones, for example, like you've talked about, where you alienate the females that would be the most effective mouthpieces for you. Or like Jason Cohn has said, I love it. He was like, he just sort of brushed over it very smoothly, but he was like, if you want to break out your black and white photo collection from the middle of the 20th century, and your flag collection and all these other things, maybe you should reconsider that, because it's in no way fucking productive, right? And yet the stream, that the pressure that's exerted by the flow of this current of the comments and the social pressure that's manufactured out of nothing, what the left likes to call bots. That social pressure is very often, it's been subverted by a loud minority like you're talking about. And generally, if you just listen to what the suggestions are that you're making, that they're making, you'll discover that they're not just stupid, they're flatly counterproductive. And so I'm less interested in the image of the gatekeeper or doorway and more interested in the idea of the fish weir. And more importantly, the most important thing is the fish weir doesn't work without a current to push you in a given direction at all times.
Interesting. I never knew that.
Over to you,
Fascinating. Kat. I've kind of come to a similar conclusion, but as I was kind of thinking about this prior to our talk and sort of making notes, I was kind of thinking like, there are sort of internal gatekeepers within the movement, and then there's these sort of external gatekeepers that people will be like, oh, they're controlled opposition and they're preventing people from joining the movement. And I kind of felt like I had to make a distinction between them, but there is still a lot of overlap. Like the internal gatekeepers, where, like with the comment sections and stuff that you're talking about, like people need to understand, like, there's no gatekeeper who gets to decide who is in or out of their movement. Like, you don't get to say that, oh, you're not really part of this or anything. Like, that's not your call to make. Not you, but like just the hypothetical you. But there is, as you say, like this reliance on kind of like shaming and mob rule, the sort of like philosophical purity, in a domain that only they set the parameters for, and you can never win because they always move the goalposts. And as you rightly ask, well, who does that serve? The external gatekeepers, on the other hand, are people like the ones who kind of tell you not to think about a certain idea. People like Jordan Peterson or Stefan Molyneux come up frequently named as those kind of gatekeepers. And I think what people need to understand is that they can just as easily be stepping stones too. And it is not the job of the gatekeeper to decide how far you go. It's up to the individual to decide if you want to go all the way. And as you rightly pointed out, there's kind of like this lack of agency on people's part, where they need to understand, your own behavior is a bigger gatekeeper than anyone else. Once a person's creative process has started, someone else can't just come and turn it off. And when a movement has a lot of truth on its side, the more you pull on those threads, the more you will come to the right conclusions. And it's only that fear of being socially ostracized that keeps you from recognizing reality. So is it really possible to be a gatekeeper? Like, just because someone doesn't take you philosophically all the way to the right ideas doesn't mean that they're preventing you from doing so. It makes no sense whatsoever to take people halfway there and then divert them away. So what we do with someone else's words and ideas is up to us. And I think people a lot of hostility toward these sort of external gatekeepers is due in part to them getting mad at the gatekeepers not using their influence to be the Messiah that they really long for. What they need to do instead is create a movement to the right of whoever the gatekeeper is, or whoever's being accused of that is attractive to those who have come up to the gate. If it's based in reality, if it has virtuous goals, people will be attracted to it. But if it's a dumpster fire, even people who share sentiments with it will not want to publicly endorse or defend it. And that may, in fact, be the position that many of these so-called gatekeepers find themselves in, where they have sympathies with the dissident right, but because it's so toxic, they need to publicly distance themselves from it just, for their own good. The movement itself is its own biggest gatekeeper. The hatred, the anger, the negativity, the blackpilling is such a turnoff to new people. And this is more of a gatekeeper than anyone else is ever going to be. It needs to be a life-affirming movement. And if your movement makes people want to run in the other direction, then it's self-evident proof that it's wrong. It's life-denying. There's no love, no compassion, no community, no friendship. If it's just an ideological shit test, that is not attractive to anybody. And I feel like talking about gatekeepers preventing people from coming to the dissident right is just a way of deflecting responsibility and, giving up your own agency. Both your own personal responsibility to come to the right ideas, but also the responsibility to create a positive movement that people will actually want to be a part of. It's not because someone is telling other people not to join the dissident right that people aren't joining it. It's because of what the dissident right is in many ways, and the way it's presented. This is why things like, calling women thots is subversive, because how many people come up to the gate and see that and say, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I'll take two.
That's actually really offensive to me. Maybe this isn't the right movement for me.
Absolutely. Why? What would draw them in? Why would they be interested at all?
Yeah, and there's constantly, just as I said, laying down these ideological shit tests, being like, well, if you don't agree with us on this and you don't agree with us on that, and you can't come in and we don't want you, and they kind of prevent new people from coming in who could actually be really valuable assets. Because frankly, I think there is a contingent of the movement that doesn't want to win. They just want to have their own little kind of exclusive club for social rejects, and it gives them a sense of belonging. They don't want normal people coming in where they're going to have to learn to be normal themselves, be productive, be positive. And maybe they feel like their movement is being taken away from them, even though it's not really a movement. It's just It's just kind of a complaining club. But yeah, that's that. So
yeah, they tend to be. It's strange. It's a similar phenomenon for me. Excuse me, a similar phenomenon. I'm trying not to say phenomena
yeah, you must
for
have
singular.
experienced this because you have kind of you seem to be a reluctant right winger, and I have seen some of the pushback that people give you and some of the negative comments that people give you. And it's like that in itself must be a bigger gate for you than anything anyone outside the movement is saying, because you seem to me like you seem like a truth seeker and somebody who just wants to understand reality and figure out the right answers to life and the universe and whatever. And you seem to have a lot of people who are constantly like trying to, do those ideological shit tests with you all the time. I see it in your comment sections. I see it on Twitter. So, I mean, what has that been like for you being on that end of it?
Not too bad, because I've gotten to this point. I mean, the same reason that I didn't fit in well on quote unquote the other side. It's in my constitution. So there's a certain amount of just no, I'm not interested. I don't care, or just, okay, you want to fight about this? Let's fight about this. So it doesn't really slow me down. And in some cases, it's very, very useful because, I mean, a certain amount of it, I just caught a stream. I think it was Iconoclast, and it had the Hue on the Offensive and Dangerfield or something like that. But they were talking about how, in terms of their red pill processes, people had to come in and actually kind of push at them. And there are a couple guys on my channel, and they don't really, I think they have some content of their own, but they're like this one guy, John Ski, another guy, Nick, who's from the Carolinas, who, I haven't met him personally, but strikes me as a good old boy that I'm kind of familiar with from life, served in the military, lives out, in a rural area, raising his kids, nice guy. These are people who jumped in on my channel, and they weren't like, big YouTube thinkers. They just engaged me in the comments and stayed on me. And so I was forced to just kind of come around and go, well, no, wait a minute. If I'm honest about that, that's a point. I have to consider that. There's another one. So we should distinguish between the people who are pushing, and sometimes it can be, irritating to be forced to have your head grabbed, and turned towards that thing, and you're right. But it has its place. On the other hand, there are the people who are just coming and being assholes. And I've been around long enough to not be bothered by that particularly. But I agree with the part, and of course other people have observed it as well, the business of, people who seem to have a major investment in their out-group status, and that they want to dig in, they want to burrow in like a chigger and just stay there as an irritant rather than really becoming anything or contributing to anything that could be taken up by a larger group of people because of its obvious value. And I think about, for example, the people who are always talking about the boogaloo and violence and warfare and how that's how it's going to get solved. It's an accelerationist refrain, right? But I think to myself, for fuck's sake, I don't know how you think war goes, but if you cannot exert yourself on this playing field, where you get to have a nap in the afternoon if you want it, and you can turn a knob and hot water will come out, and you can get antibiotics, or if your tooth goes bad, you can go see a dentist and no one's shooting at you. If you can't take arms against the sea of troubles in that set of circumstances, then what makes you think that if you can't even make a living and get set yourself up in the world, what makes you think that if all the shit goes down and we go to hell in a handbasket swiftly, that you're suddenly going to be able to rise above and your valor and virtue will shine in those, bellicose circumstances. I don't see it,
They're just revenge fantasies is what they
Indeed.
are.
Indeed. That's a nice short way to say it. And they're about as productive as indulging in any such fantasy ever can be, which is not at all.
It's escapism.
Yeah. And a particularly unpleasant kind. It's an escapism that they seek to sell. It's kind of like the missionaries that show up and like, have you heard the good news, brother? Let me share my revenge fantasy with you, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that I think that in itself is a good form of kind of the movement gatekeeping itself, because the vast majority of people are like, I don't want society to collapse. I don't want a war. I don't want people that I love to die or, to suffer. It's not attractive at all to anybody, except people who have literally nothing to lose. And that's sad. I do genuinely feel sad for those people that that's the state that their life has become. But it is it is incumbent upon them to envision and build a life in which they would have something to lose. And I think that would probably be a more productive outlet for them. But yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like you, where I don't really feel like I fit in very well in any particular camp. My tactic these days is more just to ignore people. I'm not one to say, let's fight about it like you are, because I'm not that confrontational. That just exhausts me. And it's like, if you're coming with, wanting to have a good faith discussion at getting to the truth, and I have the energy for it, that's a major factor,
circumstance
then let's
dependent.
talk about it. But if you just want to have a debate for the sake of debate, I'm too old for that. I'm not interested in having internet debates with people. Like, I know what I believe. I largely know what you're probably going to say. And if you just want to have an argument so that you can feel like you've won something, like, go find someone else who has the time for that, because there are other ways I would rather spend my time. And I just don't feel like arguing about it is very productive. And that behavior, this kind of aggressive, confrontational, like, let's debate about everything attitude that seems very prevalent. I don't see that being attractive to anybody except maybe newcomers who are just very excited about the ideas and they're still learning. For somebody like me who's been in this for so long, I've kind of heard it all, and it just becomes tiresome after a while. And I just want to like focus on just like reading the books that I want to read and thinking about what I want to think about, and not like, I don't want to have confrontations with people. I would much rather find common ground with people. Like, I don't feel that I need to agree with somebody 100% on all their political and religious ideologies. If you want to promote white well-being, then I will amplify your messages that promote white well-being, and I will just ignore the rest. Because it doesn't matter to me.
Right.
There are going to be people who agree with that person politically and religiously, or whatever other ideologies they hold. It doesn't have to be me. And I don't have to agree with them to be like, yeah, you're a good person, you're a comrade. I'm happy to kind of amplify your message and work with you on this one specific issue that we both agree on. But this insistence that we must all come to a consensus on religion and politics as well is just, to me, I just feel like it's such a huge distraction and is just a constant source of division, negativity, and toxicity.
Well, fuck all that then, right? We don't need it. To hell with it.
Yeah.
Which brings us around to boomer.
What you said, but without the cuss words.
Oh, yeah, pardon me. My vulgarity is something that I will never fully scrape off my shoe. I will never show myself fully to be a gentleman, because I've habituated myself to cursing.
Only because there's not another word for it, really.
Well, yes. And
so you get it back.
There are moments when, you lay a well-timed expletive and it can be rhetorically useful, but in any case, I abuse it. So we've got boomer. I will have to leave much of that to you, because I think I touched earlier on upon the whole business of millennial being abuse going in one direction, boomer is abuse going in another direction, and the whole business of severing the links between the generational cohorts. So I feel like I've kind of said my piece on that. So over to you, Kat.
We're getting far enough into the list that we're going to start to have some overlap on these concepts, because in many ways they do sort of all tie together. So what is a boomer? I mean, it's not even a term that's just limited to actual baby boomers anymore. It has come to mean, I think, someone who is so old that they're out of touch with reality. But I think it's really just another word for normies. And it's a word that I don't particularly like. It's like thought, in that you have people who talk about trad values and then have no respect for their elders. it's true that many boomers do have stupid ideas, and those stupid ideas should be rejected, but it's still subversive in that it's divisive, in that it promotes kind of that division between the different ages, as you spoke about earlier. Yeah, these older people are out of touch with the culture, so their takes do seem kind of mind-numbing and dull. But it I don't think it warrants a wholesale dismissal of elders, and having a general negative attitude towards an entire age group closes you off to the wisdom that many in that age group have to share. I mean, you have to remember, many of these actual boomers spent their whole lives fighting Marxism. They're not all leftists. And people will talk about how they want to go back to the 1950s and then hate all the people who grew up in that era. And it's the innocence of that period that makes it attractive, but that's also why boomers are so naive. And they do vote more conservative. I think they're just more easily brainwashed, and they don't get the bigger picture because of that naivety that they have. But as I said, this movement is it's very young. It's basically being run by a bunch of 20-year-olds who think they know everything and don't want to listen to anyone older who might know more. But when you look amongst all of the bright lights and leaders within the movement, all the very prominent people, you don't ever see any of them disparaging boomers, women, or any other group as a whole. It's only the young ones who have just joined up in the last 6 months and they just want to have a laugh and be edgy. And maybe they don't realize how subversive and divisive it is and how damaging it is. We should want to have boomers on our side, if for no other reason than they are kind of the bulwark against whites becoming minorities in our own countries. It is advantageous for us to get them on board.
I can totally see that. Yeah, I mean, the more the merrier, in the sense that you have to carry a certain number of people in terms of their opinions, outlooks, and views in order to, turn the ship, however slowly, to change its bearing. I don't really know what I can add to boomers there. I think I agree with what you set forth there. You want to get those people on side. And I've already expressed the business about trying to cut the links in the generational chain, and drive the wedges in that will force the different generational cohorts to fight one with the other. And I think it goes hand in hand with the business of having the men and women fight one with another. Different age groups, different religions, the whole mess of atomization and fracturing and balkanization. So, yeah, I covered my view on that. Now, the next term we have here is Nazi. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know what I can say about it. I look down here, I don't have a damn thing in my notes, just because to me, it's as meaningless a term as racist. It's utterly meaningless. It's so emptied of content that it's actually like it's inside out. You go looking in the pocket and you can't find anything in there, and then you pull the pocket out to get the pocket lint and dust out of it, and you fold it in the other direction and you clean everything. It's that empty. Like there's nothing there. On the one hand, it's the smear du jour that has held sway unchallenged for 70 years now, or thereabouts, and yet it really does appear to be meaningless. Now, I do get that there are a number of National Socialists who are over here on the right. As I've joked before, I don't have a thing for itchy black wool uniforms, so I tend not to get along with them. But insofar as they're adding their voices to the pushback against the anti-whites, I'm perfectly happy to make common cause with them to that extent. And I've met a few. I think they tend to be pretty quiet about it, and they'll tolerate me insofar as I too am, I'm signed my name at the bottom in terms of that project, right? Pushback against anti-whites. All for it. But the term itself is just so, to me, devoid of meaning that I don't even know what to do with it. So this, I'm afraid, is going to be, this is where you get to ice skate with the spotlight.
Again, I think this was actually one that you put on the list.
Did I?
I think you did.
Well, then you have to try to prompt me a little bit and help me to remember what the issue was with it. I don't know.
Well,
I can
feel
even...
free to interject, I guess, if you think of anything. Yeah, as you say, it's like calling somebody racist. It's just another variation on Godwin's law. Both the right and the left do it to each other. Oh, they're the real Nazis. It's like, it has increasingly in the last 20 years come very rarely to mean literal Nazis or neo-Nazis, of which there are almost none. All white dissident voices are being smeared as being Nazis. And if the left had any self-awareness, they would find this shameful and not intellectually honest or fair. It is a term, it is designed to slander, vilify, and dehumanize white people. It's no different than calling Muslims terrorists. And it's designed to cause people to look with hostility and distrust at white people as a group. Now, has it started to lose its power because it's been overused? Is it no longer effective because of that? Or is it being used more and more because it is losing its power and it's in its death throes? Or is it still effective? Those are some interesting questions. I mean, it is still effective in the sense that all it takes is one accusation of being a Nazi to ruin somebody's entire life or career, but people are starting to get resentful of it. I do see it as a sign that, this overuse of terms like Nazi and racist is thrown at just any random white person. It's just like, doesn't matter who you are, somebody's going to come and call you a Nazi or a racist if you're white. But the people who shout Nazi are the ones losing their cool. And it's a sign that they're failing, because when you're winning, you're smiling and cheering. When you're losing, you're angry and frustrated. That's what the loser looks like. That's Trump derangement syndrome. It's like a tyrant swinging around a club, but everyone's laughing at him. Now, he might still take some people out, but no one really respects him. And so I think the reason that they're kind of amping up this rhetoric is, they want a future where they can control the narrative again, like they did before there was the internet. And maybe this is why we experience this disjointedness when we observe the modern world, because we have these mainstream media voices who are obviously lying. And then we have the internet that easily exposes those lies. And when the liars are exposed, they know the jig is up. They've been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. So they should apologize and get on the other side of their mistake to regain the moral high ground. But instead, they're doubling down and calling people Nazis for noticing that they've done the wrong thing. To me, it's a sign that they are not just losing, but even just kind of losing confidence in their kind of own left-wing Marxist movement.
Well, to me, the only thing that really comes to mind, I agree with what you said there, and I don't really.
As you should.
Indeed.
You can disagree with
right.
that.
This is where the simp comments appear, below this video once it posts. The one thing I will say about it is that the one thing that might drive me to be a lot more tolerable about someone who does claim to be a self-described, Nazi, and I don't see him. If I extend it by thinking Nazi is a contraction of National Socialist in German, okay, there are some of them. And I'll tell you what, man, again, I'm not big into itchy black wool uniforms, but just the sheer volume of, he's the real Nazi, she's the real Nazi, these ones are the actually Nazi, the Antifa are the real Nazis. I'm just, bring commie back. Like, why does Nazi have to carry all the weight for everything? Even these people who are supposedly, like center right and the rest, they fetishize it. I almost said they want to rub their hands together and, think long and hard about it. But I probably shouldn't say that. It's just the whole term. It's dead. It's dead. And, or I mean, it still has effect. Like you said, it's not correct to say that it no longer can be, be used to wound or smear or destroy. But It's
I
like
do think it's on the decline, though.
Absolutely. It's like repeating your name to yourself over and over again, as I did as a young lad on a few different trips, and I began to say, oh, what the hell does this name mean anymore? Those deep moments as a teenager,
so weird.
Right? But I repeated my name to myself, and you can do it even when you're not fucked up, and it will empty itself of meaning, like the repetition. It's like having a scent around you, right? If you wear a perfume, you're going to be the one person who doesn't smell it anymore. If you repeat your name to yourself, suddenly it sounds like this jumbled up thing that doesn't carry meaning. In the same way, I think the repetition of Nazi, it's just, it's not long for this world. I would go so far as to suggest that perhaps it is moribund. Okay, so we have grifter.
All right.
Grifter
Do you want to go first this time?
What makes you feel best, Kat? What would you prefer?
I feel like your turn is long overdue.
Absolutely. Okay, then I'll go first. I have to wonder.
I want to be fair to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that you're willing to.
It's your channel. You should do the talking. And
guests,
look,
actually, you should.
I'm just a woman. What do I know?
You should make room for a guest so that person can shine. I don't want to have my guests on and force them to place their light under a bushel basket, for example. Grifter. I tend to think that there's just some bitching about making money in general going on there, with the idea that this or that person is a grifter. Now I have not gotten that accusation. I think it's pretty apparent, for example, that I don't have a super chat. I have nothing against people who do at all, but I don't, all anybody has to do if they want to ask me questions in a live stream is just make sure to put the little @semiagog thing so that I can actually see it as it flows by in the chat, right? For that reason, I haven't gotten grifter thrown at me. I do have a P.O. box, and Tim's always talking about folding money. And I do have the different accounts, the Subscribestar and GoFundMe and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, I haven't had it thrown at me. I have seen it thrown at a whole lot of other people, though, just constantly. Anyone who attempts to make a living out of, this whole remote content business gets called a grifter. And you can extend it, people who appear on like Fox News or people who do their little conferences and the rest. There is an edge you have to be aware of that you have to walk. And on one side of it is the reality that there are people trying to scam folks for money, by being intentionally provocative or outrageous in order to, make some money. The other reality, though, is particularly when it comes to people who are producing right-wing content, you put your face out there and use your name. I mean, even if you put your face out there and don't use your name, I chose to use my name because I'm old enough now. I work for myself. They can't go after an employer, right? Nobody gives a shit, right? I've been in my business for a long time, and, I work with people who don't give a damn about any of that. They care about, can you do what we have to have it yesterday, right? Actually, they would laugh. But you use your name, and you have actually stuck your neck out there, and all kinds of hell can rain down upon you. I mean, look at Stefan Molyneux. Like I said, I just saw the JF debate with him, and I think much, much less of him now. I mean, it already had a kind of downward trajectory, but I think much less of him now than I did after seeing the games he played there. But I bring him up because, he's been smacked. He was growing there. YouTube has completely throttled him. I think they brilliantly chose to throttle him just short of getting 1 million subscribers. And I think he's probably fucking weeping tears of blood because that particular, hoop of fire he wants to jump through has been denied him. He's always got to sit there. It's like a Tantalus punishment in hell, right? He can't get to 1 million subscribers. But he's been smeared. He uses his own name. And, whatever you want to say about Stefan Molyneux, I think, an attachment to an almost pathetic attachment to certainty and a sort of tight-lipped, thin-lipped sort of Protestantism. Those seem to me to be the problems with Stefan Molyneux, right? Masquerading as whatever new methodological or, conceptual certainty with his UPB framework or whatever. But he's not a Nazi. The thing is, however, that he's out there, and because he's, for example, talked quite reasonably about, IQ exists. It does measure things. It is distinct based on racial or ethnic groups, or it can be distinguished. He's catching hell for it. He's got to make a living. You call him a grifter for trying to make money online, and where else is he going to go now? Anybody does a search on him, they're going to get 1 million. I mean, I saw people following, no white guilt around and posting nasty blog posts about him and trying to destroy his life. I'm sure you've seen that. Many people have seen it. Everybody's experienced it to one degree or another. So, I guess what I'm saying is, on the one hand, it feels to me like the grifter thing is just sort of a general smear against anybody who's trying to make a living. But bandying that about with too much enthusiasm, not enough care and foresight in applying it, because I did agree that they do exist. There are people who just seem to be driven by money and who probably shouldn't be getting ours, and we shouldn't be wasting time with them. Nevertheless, in the case, granting that those people do exist, we should be really careful about throwing that term around on the right, simply because the people who come out, like in my case, using my actual name, you begin to shut off other paths for yourself. You begin to lose opportunities. There is a price to pay for it. I don't want to be like, oh, woe is me. I expect to be given the grass crown by a grateful Senate because I spoke online about the fact that there are anti-whites. So don't assume I'm exaggerating, but you can be screwed by this, and it affects your life forever. Your prospects, your ability to be employed, the likelihood that you're going to find a date. It's crazy. So to jump on those people who are trying to make a living when they don't really have another way to do so, I think is unfair, and in many cases, is in many cases unfair and unwarranted.
Yeah, exactly. What specifically is a grifter? It's generally somebody who, the accusation kind of means you're not really sincere about your ideas. You're just repeating these talking points so that people will give you money. It's applied a lot more to women than men. And I think it does also go back to this idea that women are just doing, if they're involved in this, they're just doing it for sexual attention, which is really interesting because it's typically not a female, it's more of a male motivation. And I think there's some projection going on there, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, I think to insert, I think men have very little idea just how not difficult it is for the vast majority of women to get sexual attention. We
don't need to say anything to get sexual attention. And in many cases, it is more beneficial for us in that regard to say nothing and keep our mouths shut. Because once you open your mouth and men find out how saucy you are, sometimes they don't like that.
Right. It's all nonsense. It's like you said, it's a masculine perspective that probably involves a great deal of projection. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, but I do still see it applied to men as well. Particularly, it is applied to people who would have once been termed alt-light, where, to people who could also be called gatekeepers, I suppose. They didn't go far enough, but they're saying just enough of the right things to take money from people on the right. Therefore, they must be grifting. They can't really be sincere, or they'd come all the way over to our side. But there perhaps should be a financial reward mechanism for spreading truth more effectively, where the more wealthy the person becomes, if we can channel all of a person's kind of selfish desire to help themselves out financially and enrich themselves, and it could somehow be tied to the exponential delivery of a given message, that would be an excellent formula.
So you're talking almost like conditioning, where you reward them, right? Where
there should be a profit. Why should there not be a profit motive for spreading the truth? It would propel the spreading ideas so much faster. And the system knows this, and this is why they are kicking people off of PayPal and Patreon and demonetizing their channels, because they know if it's not profitable for people and they have to go back to doing a crappy day job and they can't make content anymore, it's a really effective way to stifle effective voices, sometimes in some cases to shut them down completely, or to greatly reduce their content and audience, their ability to produce at a high quality. I mean, I'm just waiting for somebody to call me a grifter since we just recently kind of set up Patreon and Subscribestar. But it's like, to produce the kind of videos that I do, it does cost money.
And a whole shitload of time. Yeah.
A lot of time.
Excuse me, really, a great deal of time.
It's more than, yeah, it's okay. I'll let you be degenerate. You can't help it. I'm just a modern person. But yeah, I mean, there's the time aspect of it too. And that, I think, is often more a consideration for people than money, because if you're working all the time and you come home and you're tired and you're just mentally exhausted, you don't have time to do, you know, the reading and the editing and the writing and the recording, because it's exhausting. And, you know, this idea that people should prove their loyalty to the cause by sacrificing their own financial well-being to make content for which they will get no thanks, because most people, I see their comment sections and they're quite cancerous. I mean, mine's not. I love my commenters, but I have seen other people, and especially bigger channels, where they're just getting criticized all the time, just constant put downs. And they're supposed to like do this for free, for no thanks and no money. Why would somebody want to do that? So this idea, again, calling people grifter, it's another subversive idea that's made its way into the movement and has for some reason become acceptable. The idea of grifting it's really an attack on the whole idea of there being a financial model around truth. And this was something that really helped move our ideas forward. We should not care about a person's motives. I don't care if a person is repeating a message because they want to make money off of it, which is silly anyway, because anybody who's done this knows there's no money in spouting any kind of even slightly right-wing talking points online. Even if you're like center right, it's a social death sentence. So I really only care how effective they are at spreading the truth. The truth is way bigger than the individual person. And all that matters is how many candles you lit with the flame you were given. So there are times when calling someone a grifter may apply, but it's grossly overused. I think it's overall a harmful term. And as No White Guilt says, we need to stop support shaming people. If somebody is able to make a little bit of money to put back into their content that they create, which, you know, they're putting it back into the movement, they're helping people. Why wouldn't we want to encourage that? Just some people maybe make way more money than they possibly need or can use, and maybe they're using it to fund some lavish lifestyle for themselves. Well, perhaps they are, but who cares? What does it matter what other people decide to do with their money and who they decide to give it to? I mean, there are people who are, you know, making a ton of money off of their donations, and they're making really good content. And I'm glad that they're out there. I'm glad that they're able to do that. If they were to lose that support, would they stop making content, make it less often, make it lower quality? Would they lose their ability to reach a wide audience with an effective message? If so, then we should not want them to lose that financial support. We should encourage people to support our creators financially. And I'm not just saying this because I am a creator. I've never really structured my content around needing support or trying to fund a lifestyle or anything, but there are people who do. There are people who have built up huge platforms and have huge audiences and have, you know, a lot of overhead probably in terms of, you know, everything costs money. And if it doesn't cost money, it costs time. What's wrong with compensating people for their time? If I hire somebody to do a job, I'm paying them for their time. You know?
Absolutely.
So that's just kind of just my 2 cents on it. I'm not by any means saying that people need to go financially support content creators. I just think we need to stop calling people grifters.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bunch of bullshit, and it's essentially a waste of time. I mean, you look at people who stick their neck out and then get attacked. You know, JF is one that comes to mind. Or look at like Millennial Woes, right? Having headlines, you know, outing him and just talking all the most insane shit about him. You know, the stuff with JF, you know, people are like, why is JF so careful about, you know, staying on YouTube and policing his language in this way or that way? And you're like, he's been shut down in every other respect, and he literally stops eating if he gets cut off in that way.
If these people lost their platforms, lost their support after sticking their neck out, being doxxed, having their names smeared, dragged through the headlines, how are they possibly going to support themselves? And why would we want to put any of our creators who have given us years of effective messaging and reaching new audiences, why would we want to put good people like that in that position? What does that say about us as a movement, that we would throw our own people to the dogs like that?
Yeah, well, it certainly underscores that question, that we've been asking is, well, we wouldn't want to do it, so who would?
I don't even see how it's compatible with the goals of the movement, which talks so much about community building. And then you're going to leave somebody unable to pay their bills and feed themselves because they got doxxed in service to the cause because you think they shouldn't have a Patreon.
Yeah, it just sounds to me like more bullshit, current.
It's jealousy, I think is what it is.
Some of it, but I think some of it is more directly subversive in the sense that it's another talking point to use to abuse these people, to create the current of social pressure with the comments and remarks that's designed to push you into the fish weir.
I do wonder how many of the voices that are calling people things like grifter or thought or gate or any of these other names we've talked about, how many of them are bad actors who are here intentionally to sow division and subversion? Absolutely. And how many of them are just useful idiots who follow the current?
Well, look at the example of Simp that just came through. There are ways in which Simp fits beautifully. People joking with academic agent talking to Daughter of Albion, or when he was talking to you, right? And everyone was like, oh, he's simping, right? And some of it's funny. And there is certainly plenty of at least anecdotal evidence out there of whole categories of ridiculous simps who are basically crawling around and abasing themselves in front of their Thot girlfriends or whatever, right? It does exist. But you can see how each of these terms is a two-edged sword, and we're seeing it borne out in many that we are considering. Simp has its place, and, there probably is something at least passingly worthwhile about calling someone who's being a simp in order to attempt to, discourage that behavior at scale. But by the same token, look at how easily it can be used to suggest that someone who's just being polite to a female is white knighting or being a simp or whatever. Each one of these things, it's about how far it's taken,
Yes, and when it's kind of starts to mimetically spread, it's no longer just kind of a funny joke anymore. It does actually become harmful in the broader context.
Yeah, can be applied harmfully. Yes. Yes.
And of course it spreads because it is initially funny. In those individual contexts, it can be funny to say things like that, but then it becomes widespread and everybody says it because they got a laugh out of it the first time, and then the next thing you know, it becomes another one of these, another example on a list of toxic terminologies.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. It's actually kind of a parallel. When I lived in Turkey the first time, and I came back after having been away for 2.5 years, and you're immersed in this other place. And back when I was first there in the mid 90s. Second half of the 90s, late middle 90s. It was, we didn't have the globalization in place. What cell phones didn't start showing up. The smartphone didn't show up until the 1990s. The internet was there, but Turkey had horrible internet connection at the time. A lot of it was running on copper lines. So you had, your 9600 modem or whatever back then. So it wasn't a global place. It was a very different place to be. And as a consequence, I felt like I had been somewhere very different. And then I came back to the US. And what very often happens is that you've been in a different place, speaking another language, or immersed in a different culture. And so you have that opportunity when you return to look at where you had come from with these new eyes when you go back. And at the time, I remember very distinctly, my friends I'd hear them saying things and they just had all these phrases, and I wasn't up to date on what the newest phrase was. That was really just a bunch of people repeating a line from Seinfeld or whatever it was, right? The talking points, that's a term that we have overused at present, but it has its place. The old fashioned talking points that had currency in superficial social interactions. It was talking about sports figures, how about those Braves or whatever, right? How they do so-and-so. Oh, I think they should have traded this player, right? The kind of crap you hear men talking about at the gym, in the sauna, who don't know each other. They'll talk about sports because it gives them something to talk about. People will superficially seize upon terms that were current, for example, in situation comedies, and they would use it. They would reuse the jokes. You're just like so-and-so from that comedy. They reuse the same line, and that was when television was sort of the aspect of culture that was most available to everyone and served as this baseline that everyone was imitating. But now we've got it with the internet, and it flows through like that. And it's just as corrosive as with the television, because I would tell my friends, I'm like, I was just in Turkey, and whatever problems they have, when you're in your circle of friends, you're not abusing each other and making fun of each other. It's not just constantly. I mean, at that age, I was in my mid and late 20s. So that's still an age where men are just talking shit to each other all the time. It's like just constantly harassing each other and grinding away. And you get a little bit of that in all cultures. But as soon as I got out of the US, I was kind of like, no, my friends will stop by and make sure I'm well if they hear I'm sick. And you'd see like men who were like hanging out at a party and somebody talked bad about their friend, and they immediately inserted themselves into the situation, even if it was uncomfortable, to defend their friend and say that he is a close friend of mine. Don't speak about him that way in my presence. Which was very different from what I'd seen in the US. And when I came back and heard the sitcom language going through everybody's mouths, I was just like, don't these people realize that this is a program designed to make you laugh with a laugh track? And the format is designed to be these little quippy one-liners written by, blue state coastal elites that are designed to, just quickly do the whole I'm smarter than you, smarmy, snarky dismissal crap. And that becomes the standard, and then it plays its role in shaping how we talk to each other socially. And you weren't there, I'm probably not explaining it that well, but I did have this moment of being like, wow, those people that whole table over there is doing nothing but repeating the things that they heard in their favorite TV shows from last week. And because those are sitcoms, which are based on making fun of each other, the whole room full of people that's supposed to be friends is really moving through cycles of making fun of each other. And I think there's an aspect of that has come around, and it's not TV anymore, it's the internet. And yet we're doing it in the same way. But
still as subversive as ever.
Absolutely. Thought.
Just the way the laugh track is subversive in how it conveys ideas that you wouldn't otherwise normally find funny and might even find downright offensive. So too are these kind of jokey, edgy, memes that masquerade as humor, but there is something a little bit more sinister under the surface sometimes.
Absolutely. And we could really work out some beautiful regalia, some tinfoil hats that are bicorns and tricorns, or pointy ones with little princess whatever hanging off of them. Right. We could develop some intense tinfoil hats, starting to think about how much subversive shit could be going on there. We however have come to Fash and Fashwave. Now, who went first last time?
I think you did.
Because
you went first. Okay, I can go first.
Then it's all you.
Until it's your turn.
All right, well, there's only one left after that.
Yeah, I mean, so this fashy kind of term, it is sort of describing a particular aesthetic, but in a cutesy way. And I have some etymology of my own. Fashion and fascist do come from the same root word, and that's why fascists are so fashionable. Hugo Boss makes some great suits.
Yes, I have heard that he did quite a number in producing uniforms.
I have no idea if they come from the same root word or not. But they sound like they might be.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
However, Hugo Boss, as you must know, was did play a role in the production of military uniforms for a certain mid-20th century Reich. Sorry. Yes.
Scared me.
Sorry. So yeah, when you mentioned Hugo Boss, I thought that was actually kind of funny.
He's a
Yes.
fashionable fascist.
But most of it is playful, right? I mean, that's the way I'm hearing most of it.
I've never seen it used as a slur. It always seems to be a compliment. I would say this is actually one of the better memes of the movement. It kind of takes this maligned word of fascist and turns it into something cool.
Right, with 80s typography and lots of fat synthesizer sounds. And fucked up haircuts, right? Does that cover most of it?
It could fall, that stuff could kind of fall under the fashy label, I would say. But it's used in a positive way to describe someone who has like a good aesthetic that is compatible with kind of movement values.
Compatible with movement values. The syncing is approved. Your syncing is approved. It is properly fashy. It is displayed by your haircut. Yes. My only issue with it
displayed by your haircut.
My only issue really is with the haircuts, because I mean, when you come to monks and roundheads, under Cromwell and all the people who have certain special haircuts, to me, I mean, I dig it. I think there are things going on aesthetically with those types of haircuts from, like, say, the 1930s and 40s. They shouldn't be, dismissed out of hand. If I didn't have, white and gray splotches for hair, it looks fine when it's long, but if I shave my head, I look like a Dalmatian, So I can't do that kind of short hair. I would even perhaps consider, haircuts along those lines. They're just a pain in the ass. Having to pay someone to cut your hair is just repulsive. But
I know.
Generally, I tend to think about the fashy haircuts. Like, I have a lot more patience for the 80s aesthetic and the synthesizers and, all that kind of crap. But the haircuts, they really, to me, they come across as, it's just like a Make America Great Again hat. You show that you're a part of that crew by having that kind of haircut. And so, it is what it is. But generally, monks and roundheads are true believers. Sorry, I cut into your...
Well, any kind of aesthetic is sort of a uniform to signify what you belong to.
Sure.
I think fashy tends to be a little bit more loose in what it describes. It's not necessarily just haircuts from a particular era. I mean, I've had people like tell me like, "Oh, you look fashy," as a synonym for, "Oh, you look nice."
Okay.
So it doesn't even, I think it's really just kind of more of a generic comment. And if people think I'm wrong, I'm sure they'll say so in the comments. But that's sort of my understanding of it.
Sure. It's just like your version of Notes from the Underground. I have not been in the movement for many, many years. Yeah, and I don't follow all of it. To me, all I ever saw...
It's a newer term, though. I mean, this is one that's only just kind of come around in the last few years.
All I ever see is synthesizers and 80s graphics, crappy 80s, like Tron style graphics and crap like that. But I suppose it could be used as an adjective in other situations. I just haven't seen it. You probably have interacted with more of these people. I'm on the outside. I'm the alt-light.
We'll bring you in.
Yeah, well, yeah. Fash and Fashy. Is there anything else you wanted to cover on that one?
No, if you've got something to say, go for it.
That's it. That's all I had, was what I said about the haircuts and the 80s graphics and things. That's all I can really hook into it. But then again, I'm not one of the cool kids and I don't keep up with it.
I don't really have a criticism to make of it, so that does tend to reduce the length of my commentary on it.
Right.
As I said, I do think it is one of the better memes to come out of the movement. I have no complaints about its usage whatsoever. And it's fun. And I don't see any harm in it. So if someone else thinks it's subversive, they can let me know. But
wow, so we have a good one.
Like
we have a term here that nobody
positivity.
Took any issue with. And I went to nightclubs as a kid with like horrific Nagel paintings and those 80s graphics and the rest. And for me, it's just kind of the mild nausea of nostalgia. For me, it's no big issue.
Well, I think you're kind of referring specifically to like the Fash wave music genre.
Yes, but for whatever reason, I've got it connected. I think there's probably something going on, which I'll grant you is not necessarily justifiable, but I will present it as an explanation rather than as an excuse. In my mind, there's a ligature between the idea of fascism and those haircuts and the fact that I'm always seeing these 80s graphics and this kind of synthesizer music. And then I tie the 80s graphics and synthesizer music to like the Flock of Seagulls haircuts and all that crazy shit from the 80s. And somehow there's a memory image that's sort of grown into itself that I can't separate these elements from. And so this is what I myself am confronted with as I grapple with these terms.
Maybe you're just a boomer.
I'm a Gen Xer. That's how it goes. Now, see, you could come in now with this being a form of concern trolling because, you know, perhaps I'm just a boomer and I'm a little worried about you and you're going into this area. So this brings us to worrying about someone going into an area and what might be happening with them, the whole idea of concern trolling.
Take it away.
I don't know. To me, I don't know if I have anything really brilliant to say about it. It seems to me that it's like, it's just much like the stuff we've seen with like Gatekeeper and Boomer, right? That there's a lot of wedge driving. On the one hand, I mean, I grew up, and all the Gen Xers like grew up being ironic about interventions, right? The whole idea that someone would come and have an intervention, you know, sit down, Lydia. We've got Johnny here, and our whole family form a prayer circle. We have all come because we're concerned about where you are going, boy, right? That was a thing that my generation was kind of tuned to look askance at. So you could see where someone attempting to push their way into your life from the atomized Gen X perspective would be something unwelcome. And so that kind of maps in some ways with the idea of concern trolling, where you pretend to care about someone, but you're really kind of smearing them and creating all these kind of mushy justifications for coming in and trying to tell them what they should do or how they should be. On the other hand, there are situations where you can legitimately come in and say to somebody, this is probably not a good direction for you. This is a big thing that like Stefan Molyneux likes to talk about all the time. You're supposed to step forward and tell someone directly when you think they're doing something wrong. You know, so from Stefan Molyneux's perspective, it's like, for example, not just good, but it's also laudable and probably a thing to be encouraged to come in and tell a couple that they're wrong for each other and they should break up, you know. And while you can say that seems like a good idea, right?
Sounds like the king of concern trolling talking.
It's there are issues going on with that. Whether or not you can even say what I was trying to hammer on, there's that. But what I was trying to hammer on is the idea that whether you think it's right or not, it never works. Inserting yourself into problems between a couple, you know, going on between two people that form a couple, it always does more harm than good. I mean, I guess
it's never welcome.
I'll say, yeah, that's probably a safer thing to say. And I'll grant you that in the case of parents who are still of an age where they have dominion over their children, there's some justifications for this. And yeah, intervention or saying you can't see them anymore, or I think he's a bad guy I'd be a little looser with that. But in general, trying to come in and change what people are doing, how they're doing it, you know, my friend Tim put it to me like this: the best you could do is you can walk up to somebody who's having trouble and you can say to them, you do realize that you're in a car. And they'll be like, yeah, okay. What's it to you? And you'll be like, okay. I mean, I'm not trying to say anything, but you're in the driver's seat. Well, yes, but I don't see why that matters. Okay, cool. You're in the car, you're in the driver's seat. Just getting the basics down there. Don't be too tense on me, man. And you realize the engine's on, right? That you're moving. I'll be like, yes. I don't see why what does it matter? Why? Why do you care? Well, I just wanted to point out, look at the speedometer there. It does read 75 miles an hour, does it not? You know, and then you can move through the process with them little by little. But the most you can do is say, you do see that about 100 yards ahead of you is a brick wall. And that's the most you can do. You have to do it in stages. You have to do it very gently. And so I question whether or not most of these interventions that concern trolling would be a manifestation of, I question whether they really ever work at all. And so that's one thing I would say about the term. The other one is just more general, and it's much like what I've been saying all along. So I'll try not to take too long saying it. It's another excuse for coming in and fucking with, I mean, it describes the process of coming in and fucking with people. But accusing someone of, how do I say this? Accusing someone of concern trolling, much like accusing them of being a gatekeeper, is yet another way of trying to silence someone who may, in many cases, simply be trying to point out issues that they see with the approach you're taking.
Yeah,
So,
there is a line there for sure.
I felt I was speaking better at the beginning of this conversation, but it's getting a little late. I need to have my dietary supplement and maybe soak my feet in Epsom salts and then have a nice nap.
Nice grandpa nap.
Yeah. What do you have anything on concern trolling?
Yeah. Interesting that you kind of compare it to like those sort of interventions and bring up Molyneux's tactics. I hadn't thought of that, but it is relevant. This concern trolling, it's just it's disingenuous. It's trying to push an agenda, and it's a type of virtue signaling. It's a way for somebody to feed their own ego, trying to take someone else down a peg while appearing compassionate. There's kind of shaming is often an element, usually masked as concern. It's manipulative and meant to, stifle debate or sow discord. And like the example you gave of Molyneux and his tactic about like pointing out that somebody's partner is bad for them or something like that, and that just not being welcome. It's like, well, what does it really matter? Like, you're not part of that couple's happy ending. Now, maybe you care about the people involved, but if you haven't been invited to give your opinion, it's not any of your business. People have the right to learn their own lessons. And so what is your motivation then for saying something? Well, it is often coming from a place of ego, coming from a place of wanting to say, oh, I told you so. And, within the movement, yeah, there is concern trolling within the movement. We do need more intellectual honesty, not the arrogance of having done a little learning. But at what point do we decide we need to take someone's criticism seriously? And when do we decide it's just manipulative and a way for them to feed their ego? And yes, there are bad ideas out there. Should we just let those ideas run around unopposed within our movement? Of course not. But it's better to put out an idea that's contrary to it rather than attack it directly. Offer alternatives instead. It would be much better to spend your energy amplifying the message of the people you do like and agree with and not waste your time on the ones that you don't. So if someone isn't for you, don't waste time like concern trolling to the people who do like that person, because even if that person's totally cringe to you, just turn them off. If there are people who support them and like their message, that's just the level they're at. Let them have their thing, right? And even if you're correct, just use your energy towards building what should be done instead. But instead, because it's an ego-based thing and so many people are so stuck in ego and just wanting to be right, rather than wanting to win and wanting to build connections and community with people in the movement, what they end up doing then is concern trolling. And it's just a way for them to feed their ego and to say, I told you so. It's very immature, really. I
also, to me, it has a rather, it smacks, it's a feminine approach. It's the idea of coming in and saying, I'm worried about you. And more commonly, I think it's more archetypal to come in and be like, we're worried about you. So you can immediately assert the pressure of a group and consensus and attitudes that's going to apply its normative pressure, and it's going to be brought to bear on the single person. So suddenly you feel like you're outside. I'm worried about you. Do you really want to be outside? We're worried about you. The more worried we grow about you, the more you're outside. Help us not to worry about you by leaving that aside and coming back. It's almost as though concern trolling is itself a particularly feminine manifestation of real gatekeeping. Because what's seldom
it is a social shaming tactic, yeah.
Yeah, and it's inverse. It's a social shaming tactic, concealed or going in the skin, under the skin of concern for that person instead of abuse towards them. It's backhanded. In that respect, it's oblique. It's rather than the direct path. It's a yin type, envelopment rather than a direct pow. I think this. It's like, oh well, all of us are very concerned about you. Yes, it's all about, well, do you know what's going to happen to you if you do that? And one of it's one of the opening gambits of concern trolling, or a concise manifestation of it, is when they come to you and they go, not a good look, because what I'm concerned about is that you look good, and I understand you would want to, and I'm just offering this as something constructive, blah, 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 you said. Well, let me tell you, that's not a good look. It's another kind of concern trolling. It's kind of a softer version of it. It's just more social shaming and pressure. And I don't think that generally is going to present as much of an issue for you, for example, because you catch shit about being a hippie or whatever when you do some streams, and you don't give a damn and you continue to do your thing. I, for my part, generally am perfectly happy to do my own thing as well and don't get pushed off my path. But I guess this brings us around to something that applies to all of these terms, which is the way we can see how our use of the terminology shapes behavior. It provides sort of knee-jerk ways to approach things. If you don't like someone, you can call them a gatekeeper. If you think they're in your way, you could justify then the idea that you need to remove that person because they're a gatekeeper and they couldn't be sincere, which then engenders this whole thing of attacking them and being confrontational and wasting time on minutia instead of focusing upon the things that we could all agree upon. We've seen...
Well, this is why I say, if you don't like what somebody's doing, just ignore them, go do your own thing, amplify the message of the people you do like, build up an alternative. Instead, what you see is people not building alternatives, not putting out a better message, but just attack, and criticize constantly.
Yeah. And that's that whole...
then they wonder, and this is why the movement is its own gatekeeper, because that behavior is toxic.
And you can almost see them.
It makes it. I personally I'm a free speech advocate in general, but not on my platforms. I do not allow comments that I think make the movement look bad.
Yeah, and that's just a call for how to present yourself.
I will just delete comments that I think reflect poorly on our movement. Go say it on your own platform if you want, right. But I don't want people who come to my channel to look at that and see oh, well, I really liked this video, but if this is what the people are about who also like it, then maybe I shouldn't like it. Right. That's not the image I want to present to people. And I, in particular, kind of try to make my videos accessible to people who are not just in the dissident right, but to anybody who's interested in, spiritual topics.
Right. And you're in a situation where you have some aims and goals that you have articulated, at least for yourself, in terms of sharing messages and having an end in mind other than just bitching and carping and all the rest. Yeah, the fine line between...
Oh, look, I am a woman. I do my fair share of complaining about things. This is it's one of my favorite hobbies.
I'm not even a woman, and I spend a considerable amount of time bitching about all sorts of things. It falls in the category of autism.
Complaining is fun. It is a way to bond with people. This is known. And it has its place within certain contexts. Where I feel it goes overboard is when it's being used to demoralize your fellow comrades, when it's being used to create division, when the consequences of it are more widespread and negative. That's different than just having a bitch fest with your friends privately.
Yes.
There you go. I said another bad. Sorry.
See, I've always been a bad influence.
Terrible influence on me. I'm turning into a complete degenerate on this stream because of you.
I have that effect on people. I've been told. This all strikes me as kind of an image. You can look at, people standing inside and outside the gate. You've got the fashy people up on the parapet looking down, and you've got the people standing outside the gate, the gatekeeper in the way, the boomers standing there, the concerned trolls are clustered around. It's almost as though we can look at all the different terms we've discussed. What we have: the movement, trad, thought, gatekeeper, boomer, Nazi, grifter, fashy, concerned trolling. We've looked at these ideas. We've seen how they reflect this virtual social space that we interact in, within. We have seen the way in which these terms can be used to create an emotional view that maybe won't be fair. Nazi's a common one. If you're a Nazi, then you want to heap bodies like cordwood and, make lampshades out of people, and you're a bad person. It's like the Saddam Hussein in his spider hole. We've talked about the way in which, calling people grifters is subversive and frames the situation so that it just becomes harder for people to make a living. Trad Thot makes it harder for women to get out there and actually be an effective voice in the front of the movement, which we also discussed. So I'd encourage all the people who have so patiently, thank you, followed our discussion here to take a moment to look at the landscape of all these terms. That's why I joked about an image in my mind of a wall with the fashy people up on it, and the gatekeeper and the boomers and the concerned trolls and the grifters, scrambling about, speaking with a forked tongue. Look at the picture that this set of terms, which is currently used on the right, paints. If we were to imagine that there were a mythical realm that came to life and represented the kind of terminology and thoughts and images that we all use, with your simps and grifters. And it's try to see it as a whole and look at what it then as a whole tells us about this movement that uses this lexicon. The one thing that stands out for me that I will close with and then turn it over to you to give your final thoughts, Kat, is that a lot of these terms, hell, all of the terms, if not empty of meaning while still being used as a smear like Nazi, or if not just sort of so vague that it makes you suspect maybe it's designed to keep you moving without thinking where you're going, like with the movement, right? There's only one term in here that really seemed unequivocally positive, and that's, fash and fashy, used in an ironic sense. I'm not into Mosley, but I just love posting images of Mosley with Yorkshire tea mugs in his hand. It's fun. And I get that's probably why a lot of the kids like to come in with their Nazi imagery to be obnoxious. But so there is that value in fashion, fashy, and using it in an ironic sense or whatever. But the rest of them, and this is my sort of closing point. Sorry, I'm trailing all over the joint. The rest of these terms are all, at least arguably, very negative and subversive. And so the one thing that I take away from this is that, I don't want to go as crazy as the left does in some ways in terms of wanting to be language police, but the choice of terms and the way in which they're used and the effects that they generally, statistically, have a probability of producing are things that we should take into account when, for example, considering what kind of terms we do and don't use and what kind of things we will and will not talk about. Given that out of all these terms we've discussed, there's really just one of them that's kind of unequivocally fun, and that in a highly ironic way, it suggests to me that maybe it's worth our while for all of us to give a little bit more thought to this and maybe not just always repeat the terms as they're sort of provided to us in the script.
Yeah. And I guess to just add to what you're saying, I do think there is this current in the movement of just kind of, there's a lot of angry people who come into the movement, understandably so. There's a lot to be angry about, but I feel like we take it out on each other, and that comes out in this sort of like nasty terminology, this manipulative language, criticizing others, putting others down, rather than being a movement that builds each other up and supports each other, and is more positive. And it's like people need to either find a better outlet for that anger or kind of go away until they can deal with it. We're all imperfect people. We all have flaws. We all make mistakes. But that does not excuse us from trying to do better. And so my hope with this conversation is that people will stop to consider some of the words that they use and think about the context in which they use them. Is this actually good for the movement? And even like you can even say, is it good for me to use these terms? Because when you're using words that are, kind of low vibrational in quality, and you're thinking nasty thoughts about people, like that's not good for your internal landscape either. it would be nice to see people kind of shift their mindset towards their fellow comrades instead of looking for things to be angry about, to be divided over, look for commonalities and ways to build each other up. And people might say, oh, but Kat, aren't you being mean to people by criticizing all of these things in this stream? Well, I'm not criticizing any person. I'm just criticizing behaviors and ideas. They are, and this is not even me concern trolling, because I do think they are bad ideas within the movement by and large. They are reflective of a sort of detrimental quality within the movement. Like there's a sickness within the movement that is bearing this rotten fruit, and that needs to be addressed at its root. Well, we can't change everybody, but we can look within ourselves and look at how we're contributing to those things. And so even like I'm guilty of this even myself. Like I will even use like thought jokingly with other women. I'm in chat groups that are called thought groups. And it's like, we use that jokingly, but maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't find that something to laugh about, as you say, as how the laugh track is subversive. So is it when you use a word jokingly like that. So that's kind of my 2 cents there at the end, and we can wrap it up because you're probably tired.
Yeah, Grandpa needs a nap. Actually, I'd like to go smoke. I'm going to be up for many more hours, but it would be good for me to go and smoke. Go do your degenerate activities. Degenerate practice I still embrace.
We can add degenerate to our next list of words.
Actually, yeah. Actually, that's how did degenerate not make it onto the list? That's a glaring error.
That all the time.
Oh man, yeah. Well, it has its moments. It really does have its moments. And some of these, I mean, as soon as you say thought, there's all kinds of things about forbidden thoughts and thought leaders. You know, we should be able to like joke about these things. There's some of it. You know, the whole business.
There's times and places for it. Yes.
Absolutely. Tim said it in one of the discussions. My friend Tim, who I often speak. You know, if people have not seen him on my channel before, I often speak with him, and I was like, oy vey, shut it down, you know, when he was saying some things that were going to cause problems for the channel. So I was like, not right now under this censorship regime, Tim, you know, and I just saw him lean back, you know, and he's in his, I guess, late 60s now. And he's Ollie, this whole thing about not being able to joke anymore, you know, and it was a strange thing to see it like register on him too. Because he is, of course, seeing it reflected in me trying to stop this particular line of discussion because it'll just piss people off and bring the censors baying like hounds. You know, we should be able to joke about it.
We should be able to joke, and there's a fine line between kind of saying like, is what I'm about to say actually funny and going to make people laugh, or am I just contributing to this downward toe of the current?
Yeah, absolutely. Where does it go?
That's the fundamental question to ask. I'm not saying don't ever use these words again. I'm not trying to be like a, thought police.
Thought police. Yeah. Right.
Nice fun. But yes, it's just about having a more conscious awareness of how the words are used and when they're used. Absolutely,
and what sort of world you want to bring into being, because part of the black magic, part of the sorcery of the left is the words spell spells. Word spell spells, and the slumbering herd compels y'all's bent neck credit check. Well-trained insects. Worldwide cash pride. State-sponsored homicide. Yes. The magic.
It's a great poem to end on.
Manipulating with all these words and terms. And if nothing else, we need to know about it in order to develop a resistance to it. And,
absolutely.
And to police our own discourse for ideological purity. Und so, we have come to the end of this discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Kat, just really quickly, again, can you tell people where they can find you online?
You can find my videos on YouTube, and you can find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Minds, Gab. I'm not too active on most of them except for Twitter. Yeah. And
all of that is under Philosophicat.
Philosophicat.
And
yeah, all of my videos have the social media links in them, so if you can just find my channel, you're golden.
Roger that. And what about the Uberfolk stuff, if people want to check out your music?
Oh, yeah. So I have a band, Uberfolk. We have a YouTube channel, Uberfolk, like with the little umlauts over the U. That's also linked on my main channel. So we put out a double album early last year, and we've been writing songs for my Revolt Against the Modern World series. And I will have a music video up shortly that we just filmed a couple days ago. So hopefully it won't take too long. Should be ready in about a month or so, tops.
Excellent. Well, we'll be looking forward to it. And I encourage everybody to check out Kat's content. And Kat, thank you again very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I am Semiagog, and I am out.